Good afternoon. All right, so I will get the names down. Today we're doing the final subject before test 3, and that is Reconstruction. All right, and so the popular narrative of Reconstruction will be covered, and as will the Agency of African Americans, as will be Dunning's thesis, and the popular interpretation as for the failures of Reconstruction. All right, so I'll get your names down, and note that we'll go over those types of facts today and interpretations. All right, so let's see here. Almost finished. So with the popular interpretation, right, you have the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, it was a supposedly a conspiracy. It was initially to involve the vice president as well as the Secretary of State. And those two, with the Secretary of State, it was thwarted with much effort and a couple murders involved. I believe 2 of his sons, of Seward's sons, were, at least one, were killed trying to protect him from Mr. Powell. And then in the case of the vice president, the gentleman supposedly lost his nerve and put down his drink and left the bar from the hotel room just above him where the vice president was staying. Not yet, Shania, but I'll tell you what, I'll go to yours right now. All right, no problem. No problem. Right. So getting into that, you have the death of the president, and then you have a story of a curious kind of devolution, going backwards, going downward with the vice president. He never was anything that even approximated an abolitionist, Andrew Johnson. Okay. No, by no one's account. Nevertheless, he sounded like a Marxist. He was for the exploited common man. He was from perhaps the most humble and poor origins, as much so at least as Andrew Jackson and any president we've ever had. And he had a major chip on his shoulder against the, quote, Southern aristocracy that he saw to be tyrannical, greedy, just throwing their weight around in Congress. And he wanted them put in their place. However, he did say that he believed the abolition of slavery would help the poor white Southerners just as much as it would help the poor slaves. So he did say that, and he made that known. But still, it was quite. He said enough during the war, okay, in the state of Tennessee, as a loyal Tennessee leader, to give hope to slaves that if he was not their ally, he at least was not going to stand in their way. But that's what happens in the popular interpretation here is he does stand in their way quite adamantly. All right. So let's see here. So weird. I can't find many of your names on this roll call sheet, which is strange. So I have to write those down separately. So at any rate, you have him taking over at the end of the Civil War. All right, in this popular narrative, there was a recess in Congress. Okay, so granted that was true, and he took over. So what he did is he initiated the 10% plan established on paper, but not by law or executive fiat by Abraham Lincoln before he was killed. But Abraham Lincoln instituting such a lenient plan for 11 states of the South to rejoin the Union was interpreted much differently from this Southern man's advocacy of the same plan, believe it or not. With Lincoln, right, he made it clear that he showed enough of his credentials in standing up for slavery that even the abolitionists who never saw him as one of their own began to show evidence, primary source evidence of gaining respect for him in taking on the issue of slavery. All right. Andrew Johnson had done no such thing. So Andrew Johnson institutes the same easy plan. With that plan, it was 1/10 of the population of each state in the South has to go to a poll, sign a formal apology for the Confederate rebellion, and a future oath of loyalty to the Constitution and to the United States of America. Just 1/10 of them. All right. You were to be temporarily disenfranchised, not given, excluded from the rights of citizenship if you were unwilling to do it, however. Okay. For how long, I don't think either of them really had ascribed an exact date, as will come shortly thereafter. But at any rate, if you're part of that 10% who says, sorry, my bad, I promise to adhere to the Constitution in the future, you could establish a new government. You could have elections amongst one another, and to keep things expedited and lacking a lot of complexity that would have been added to it, according to Andrew Johnson, he used the citizenship rights of the antebellum generations. So no African Americans. All right, just those of the antebellum generation who were considered citizens, and those amongst those citizens who signed the oath. All right. And you also had to agree to the 13th Amendment, and that formally abolished slavery, right? And then you write your own state constitution, and you send it back to Congress for affirmation and to be re-annexed into the Union. Well, when he does so, he handpicks provisional governors. And without exception, the provisional governors, by today's standards, were extremely discriminatory, prejudiced, and they engaged in ethnic discrimination. And so he picked some racist white dudes over this new territories of the South. And before you know it, these states, having such easy readmission policies, one by one get readmitted, and they circumvent the abolition of slavery and the end of the Civil War. They get around it, right? So they issue, for instance, like these black codes, with the black codes that said, okay, African Americans, they're technically free, but they have to have a work permit, and they excluded them from the skilled trades and others as well. So they're pretty much forcing them in a roundabout way to go back to the plantations and work. Now, granted, they have to be remunerated, right? They have to be given some type of wage now, with slavery abolished. They got around that as well. So a lot of them felt beholden to work again for the plantation owners. Not only that, you had vagrancy laws in the black codes. Many African Americans were looking for family members, and they were roaming around trying to find them. If you were found loitering or trespassing on someone's property, you were fined an amount of money that there's no way you had as a freedman. And you had a planter who would volunteer to pay that fine for you. And of course, you had to work it off with the planter. So they call this in Latin America, right? Debt peonage. They keep you indebted and keep you trying to work off your debts on their plantation. They not only that, they paid their African-American laborers in scripts. Okay. And with scripts, they could only use their own private, monetary system. You had to spend that money on their plantation store. And so they were getting the African Americans, they were exploiting them. It really was, as Professor up the hill at UC Davis, Clarence Walker has stated, it was slavery in all but name. Okay. They couldn't carry guns. They couldn't congregate in certain high numbers together publicly. They had to, like, symbolic things. They weren't allowed to wear silk. In some areas of the South, they were not allowed to own a carriage. They had to give the way of the sidewalk for white women, et cetera, et cetera. So it was trying to keep that sense of subjugation over the African Americans despite the legal emancipation of them. And so this happens. Then you had a committee from the Senate under Charles Sumner, the guy who was almost beaten to death for a speech against slavery prior to the Civil War. And some of the members on the very committee who traveled down into the South to investigate were physically attacked themselves as Yankees. And they, of course, came up with a lot of nasty facts that we've derived, helped us derive some of the facts that we have today. So, for instance, in Texas, at the end of the Civil War, there were 5,000 documented murders of white on black. All right. And I kid you not, all 5,000 were exonerated. They were declared innocent by white juries and white judges. So down in the South, you have the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established during the war, and they were to adjudicate or referee disputes between black and white Southerners, and they were to help the plight of the slaves and the runaways, and to try to help them out. And Congress had created it. Well, President Johnson vetoes the bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. He said that it was racist because it primarily aimed to help black Southerners and not white. Then they passed a very lukewarm 1866 Civil Rights Act that established basic economic rights of citizenship to African Americans. They were to be remunerated in pay. They could buy and rent property, etc. And he vetoed that. And so then in addition to that, he begins more than one speaking tours. And he was known to be inebriated during many of his speeches. And he became just, he showed a side that genuinely surprised a lot of people, disappointed a lot of people. He used the N-word and the need to keep them in their place. The South had suffered enough. Remember, he himself was a Southerner, and all this, and it just backfired up in the North. So the members of the committee come back. They have dire news. They're hearing in the newspapers about the black codes and all this. They're getting this type of obstinate pro-South, behavior from the president himself. And that's when the new Congress convened, and this begins what would be called radical or congressional, or to the white Southern racist, Negro Reconstruction. Okay. So they meet back up and they take roll calls in both houses, and they refuse to say a single Southern person's name. They ask afterwards. They said, "We don't recognize you. You're back to territorial status. We have higher standards for your readmission into the Union. You got to start over." All right. So at any rate, they remove the racist governors. They put in military personnel and send the troops back into the South to ostensibly to protect the quote Negroes. All right. And they forced them to not only sign over the 13th Amendment, but also the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is pretty big. It nationalizes the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, right? And it makes it very easy, a very easy criterion for it. If you are born or naturalized in any single state, you are to be declared a citizen in all of the states. And the Constitution applies to you, and you are entitled to all the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship. All right. So at this time, many of the southern states reconvene. They have new plebiscites to vote people into a state convention. And the question arises, okay, does that mean African Americans have that privilege of citizenship? Because, you know, I could arguably, it's a nice blanket that's supposed to cover everything, but at the same time, it could be deemed as being ambiguous. What are the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship? So, in very quick fashion, the newly elected congressmen, and now they have much more radicals who have been elected into office, because there was a turnabout in public opinion in the North. The president and his racist governments of the South had been so regressive, right? Like going backwards, that all you had to do during these elections and this time, supposedly, according to Alan Brinkley, was to wave the bloody shirt. That expression, right, is to remind everybody how many Yankee soldiers had died in the Civil War. And that if the president and his reconstructed states have their way, then all those Yankee boys died for nothing. There has to be some change. The South is, quote, unrepentant, and they have an ally in our president. So at any rate, the pendulum swung enough to put in a lot of radicals into this new Congress. And Congress declares that on Article B of the 14th Amendment, it states that if you at any time had sworn allegiance to the Constitution, and then you had subsequently broken that allegiance, then you are to be disenfranchised for 2 years. All right. And think about who had done such a thing. Anybody who had any kind of office, military office, right? So military officers, any kind of politician, right? Any kind of federal bureaucrat or state one for that matter, politician. So what they're basically doing is they're taking citizenship away from the leaders of the pre-war South for 2 years, because so many of them had been in those such positions. So at any rate, in addition to that, they quickly passed the 15th before all the states have been re-included. There were like at least 2 left. And they said, oh, by the way, you also have to pass the 15th. And the 15th says, you know, in case it's not obvious, the privileges of citizenship include the right of suffrage, the right to politically participate in government, run for office and vote. Okay. So a couple of states had to do that as well. And it was ratified by the Congress, as well as the required number of state legislators. So it passes. And now it's very clear that African Americans are bona fide citizens entitled truly to the rights, protections, and privileges thereof. So at any rate, when they run the state legislator elections, a couple of alarming things happened. Is one, there were about 1 million now eligible African American voters in the South, and well over 750,000 went regularly to cast their ballots on election days. At one point, Eric Foner, a popular historian on this topic, says that African American participation in elections ran upwards of 90%. And what do we have today? We're lucky if half the population votes for president. So at any rate, they jumped in with gusto, right? And so then the states of Louisiana, the Black Belt District of Mississippi, and the state of South Carolina elected an overwhelming number of, quote, Negroes to office. All right. And when they did, they primarily showed an age-old sense of deference to a certain demographic of Black men. Basically, to me, generically, I think of it as men who had reason to feel a sense of noblesse oblige, right? The nobleman's obligation that, okay, I'm in an influential spot where a lot of Black men and women look up to me, and I deem it my responsibility, my civic virtue, to look after them. Okay. So what were some of those demographics? Part of that demographic, one were preachers. A lot of Black church preachers were elected into office. A lot of freedmen prior to and during the Civil War. Remember, although they made it very difficult in the southern states, and in a few states deemed that the moment you were emancipated, you had to have so many hours to get out of the state because they didn't want free, quote, Negroes in their state, giving false hope to the slaves that were there. But with those exceptions, they're developed enclaves, right? An enclave is like a Chinatown, an ethnically homogenous part of a city of that group of people. And so they developed enclaves in Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, Louisiana, Nashville, Tennessee, and some of these other cities, right? Richmond, Virginia. So a lot of them looked to them because they had become literate. They had become successful members of the bourgeoisie. Now, remember, of course, they often had to deal only with Black clientele because of the racism that was so prominent in their time. But nevertheless, they were making it, and some were doing well for themselves as African-American leaders of the local community. So they were largely chosen in this initial election of the state legislators. And remember, with the state legislators and the federal offices for that matter, like governor, you have a lot of patronage positions, positions that are appointed by the governor of the state, right, et cetera. And it goes at all levels, by the mayor of the city, et cetera, and the councilman. And so you have appointed all kinds of tax assessors, elected judges, those just different positions, right, that had newfound power to seek revenge on some of their old planners. So tax assessors, for instance, right, they would get to go in some cases to their old master's plantation and decide the worth of his property, which would thereby determine the amount in taxes that he would have to pay. Judges, you can imagine the power, the newfound power that was given them. And you had an African-American at the end of the war capture his old master after he had run away and joined the Union Army. And his regiment defeats his master's regiment, and he literally gets to take his ex-master as a prisoner of war. And he smiles at his master and he says, well, boss, it looks like the bottom rail's up this time, right? The bottom rail of the fence is on the top now. So that is commonly put in textbooks. And that's what you're kind of referring to this theme now, is that this is suddenly just kind of, restrictively poetic justice, okay, at this time of congressional reconstruction. And so at any rate, you had hundreds, if not more. I have numbers in this somewhere, in one or two, the exact number of state legislative assemblymen that were elected into office. You had 2 lieutenant governors, you had 2 senators, you had about 24 House of Reps, congressmen that were Black and elected into office. But supposedly, after about a year and a half, according to multiple sources, the sources I'm using are W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, and his Black Reconstruction book, as well as Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction, which is very, very, received multiple awards and all that, is they contend that within about a year and a half, the Black voters actually began voting in a majority of ex-slaves into the legislature of their states or of the national legislature of Congress. So in Congress, you had suddenly a handful of ex-slaves who had to have scribes because through no fault of their own, they'd never learned to read and write. And so they had scribes read and write for them as they served their constituents. And so to a lot of racist white Southerners, this was just too much. They put in multiple petitions to the president and to Congress saying, quote, this race of people have had no experience with political government, and this is ridiculous to give them the reins, etc., which of course was an exaggeration, because I believe the state legislature was dominated by African Americans in only one state, and that was South Carolina, because of demographics. But everywhere else, they were not the majority, but they were a peaceable, sizable faction. Okay, so then in addition to them, you had thousands of Yankees move into the South. Some were led by idealism, evidently. They came down to work at the old Freedmen's Bureau schools to teach African-American children how to read and write. Okay. And so you had some of that sort. But then you had others who were licking their lips at the destroyed property of the South and many debtors' inability to pay off their creditors at the end of the war. And they saw it as a right place to make profit in its low state. So, of course, that type of immigrants from the North were the ones who dominated the negative caricature of the Yankee coming into the pro-war or post-war South, and they called them carpetbaggers, right? So you had some carpetbaggers who got involved in government as Republicans. The African Americans en masse became Republicans. It was a Republican Party that freed them. And then you also had a smaller contingent of white Southern Republicans who actually chose the Republican Party, being white Southerners, and they were called scalawags at that time. So in the press, this becomes in the South the hated triumvirate, right? When you had like the hated three guys ruling Rome, now you got the hated carpetbagger, the quote Negro, and the scalawag running the show for now. So at this time, right, African Americans, they did what they could. Let's see, like some of the accomplishments. All right, like you see right here. Thus ensued the foundations of the disintegration of the antebellum South, notorious for its racial discrimination and exploitation, oligarchic domination by the planter class, its pre-industrial economy, and its lack of fluidity, infrastructure, available credit, and bourgeois foundation. So all of these things began to take a turn toward a more modern, more bourgeois, like of the city, look, if you will. The old planter class lost its economic domination, as well as its political clout. All right, so that had been somewhat broken. They brought down lots of bankers from the North, Jay Cook and these other guys. I think a young J.P. Morgan and others are ready to make money in the South, lending money for interest. And so the availability of credit was greatly enhanced in the South. All right. They began to invest in infrastructure in these new state governments. Namely railroad and canal construction for transportation and communication. And so then in addition to that, right, is they established safety net legislation. All right, safety net legislation. So let's see here. Right here, safety net institutions. Orphanages, public schools, almshouses for the homeless, mental asylums, as they were called, were given state patronage to exist for the less fortunate in these states. All right. By the way, with the public schools, they were to be integrated according to these new state legislators and governors, but they not a single state remained such. Literally, it was white flight. The white parents ultimately refused to send their white kids to school with black kids. So then you had different levels and areas of cities and states that de facto became the kind of the beginning of Jim Crow, black schools and white schools. Remember, the Freedmen's Bureau had already established, along with upcoming leaders like Booker T. Washington, the idea of establishing black universities. And that is in its formative years right now. All right. But look at this, literacy levels for African Americans increased by over 30%, by less than 10% to over 40% literacy for Black Americans. They found that in a lot of these schools for kids, many adults, Black adults, came and sat in the desks with the kids who had been enslaved and never had a chance to gain basic literacy. And they wanted to learn to read and write as well. And so real moving instances such as that. A lot of them left the white churches in the South and formed their own Black churches, most of which tended to be either Baptist, Methodist, or Episcopalian, all Protestant Christianity. All right. They established fraternal organizations like Liberty Leagues and Lincoln Leagues, whereby they would have people pay their fees, and they would help provide for one another. First of all, they would have regular meetings, and they would read from the local newspaper, those who could read, and apprise their fellow African American neighbors of what was going on with the federal government, what their rights were as of this point, what a good course of action should entail, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they were doing it at the Black churches as well. The initial Black churches at the end of the Civil War were very politically oriented. All right. And so at any rate, you have all of that going on as far as Black agency. You had a guy named Cardoso, who was known for absolute integrity as a Black politician, for how he ran the budget in his southern state. And I apologize. His name was Francis Cardoso. I can't remember what state it was. You had Blanche K. Bruce, and Blanche K. Bruce became the father of Black education in the state of Mississippi as their senator. And he continually fought to try to educate the young African-American youth, and to try to get them both vocational-oriented education, to practically teach them a job trade right away, and also fully academic education, right, to try to prepare them for college, for a collegiate degree. So you had that as well. Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was, he helped dignify and give a sense of just pride to the African Americans. He made it clear that they had been wronged for years, and due to their unrequited labor, right? And unrequited labor is a perfect term for what happened, right? Like unrequited love. One person loves the other one, but it's not reciprocated. They work and they don't receive anything back for hundreds of years. And so at any rate, he says, due to unrequited labor, they should involve land redistribution. Take from some of the old Confederate leaders some of their property, and give remember the Freedmen's Bureau tried, as well as the U.S. Army tried in some parts near South Carolina, 40 acres and a mule allotted to each Black slave family. But of course, remember, that didn't stick, and the racist president, Andrew Johnson, met several times with the leaders of the Supreme Court, and no doubt tried to influence them in the way in which they did go. And that is that technically, according to the Fifth Amendment, you are entitled to government protection of your life, liberty, and property, unless you have had due process and been duly convicted of a crime. So on that technicality, they gave that land newly given to the ex-slaves back to the old masters, back to the old planters. So at any rate, Robert Smalls, he tried land redistribution. It didn't work. But again, he gave African Americans, he gave them a steroid shot to their collective confidence as a faction of Black Americans. All right. So despite all this, right, sadly, you have something that did happen, evidently. You have primary source evidence of it anyway. And that is that you have evidence of corruption. All right. When you have more than one railroad bidding to go through your town, it was very common for one, both, or multiple railroads to offer you a bribe to choose their railroad to go through your town instead of their adversaries. When you knew ahead of time as a politician of land that was going to become developed with railroad tracks coming through it and the cities blowing up there, you know that you could use that inside information, right, and purchase that land and wait for it to more than quadruple in value once it was developed, and then sell it for great profit. And what happened oftentimes with people who succumb to that temptation, most of the time that I've read, it was not themselves. It was family members and loved ones that they were trying to help and enrich and give a helping hand to, that they did such with. All right. So some took bribes. Some were using insider information. They called it graft at that time. Also nepotism, right? Getting in a position of patronage to appoint different positions. And you appoint people that you likely know are not theoretically, literally prepared and qualified for that job, but you do because you're related to them or they're a friend of yours, etc. So nepotism happened as well. Okay. And so at any rate, when these things happen, the Southern press ran with it and they called it Negro misrule. All right. And what W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American himself, right, what he writes in it is basically, and I hope I'm not oversimplifying, that yeah, it happened, but I challenge any historian to compare it to the rest of the country and the rest of Western civilization at that time. Because of the growing infrastructure, the new business development, the new incorporation of credit into areas, etc., these types of temptations naturally arose, and they often succumbed to them anywhere they arose. After all, right, Mark Twain wrote about the 1870s. He wrote that it was the Gilded Age, right? And if something's gilded, it has with metallurgy, it can and often entail some type of corrosive agent, and the gilded process is extremely superficial. You just cover it over with something that looks nice and durable. And so that was his name for this time period, is that it all looked glamorous and glittery, but if you scratch the surface, you see that there's lots of corruption and ugliness and exploitation. Because remember, this is the time now of the rise of the robber barons, right? Like Rockefeller and Carnegie and others that you learn in your 17B class. So that's all going on everywhere. But what happens, right? Of course, is the combination of allegations of misrule. You also have the second component of states going broke. Remember, the Southerners at this generation especially were highly, highly averse to being taxed. That have been part of their libertarian upbringing for generations. And so they, it takes money to make money. And for you to have safety net legislation, for have developed more of a welfare state in your state, you got to get the money somehow. And so oftentimes it's through increased tax revenue. And they could not get that. They could not, it was like pulling teeth, extracting tax revenue in their southern states. So many of them implementing what many liberals would contend are glorious institutions like public schools and orphanages. They went broke doing such. And of course, the African Americans were blamed for it. So then you have time for re-elections in the state legislators. And it was the same mantra, right? Is respectable budgetary responsibility. They wanted new people in that were fiscally more frugal and did not spend and did not tax. They wanted smaller government, right? And they wanted to get away from this big government safety net stuff. So what I found in these two sources is a lot of the white Republicans in office, they did not stand by the African Americans at this time where they were scapegoated. And instead, right, they kind of distanced themselves from them and promised to be more fiscally responsible if they could be reelected. So all of this has happened. That is, notice it was kind of like a pendulum swing both ways, right? So it went completely, to the right and being regressive with President Andrew Johnson. Then it went to the left with congressional Reconstruction, right? And the rule of the triumvirate. And then people tired of that when those things happened, as I mentioned, and then they went back to the right again in their public sentiment in the South, at least. So then in addition to that, you have the end of the 2 years of disenfranchisement for those who had taken an oath to follow the Constitution and then subsequently broke it. So hence the old elite, now they're back in the game. And they had not lost a step as far as their knowledge, how to cultivate votes. And when I say cultivate, oftentimes I mean basically buy votes, etc. Then in addition to that, you had, because of, quote, accusations of Negro misrule, you had a white Southern cultural backlash and the rising fame of the Ku Klux Klan under ex-cavalryman of the Confederacy, Forrest. So Forrest and his guys, they began terrorizing African Americans, attacking them when they went to the polls to vote, burning down Black churches, etc. It got so badly that Andrew Johnson, his administration will pass. He's not reelected. And the old war hero Ulysses Grant comes in. And Grant, you can see a little bit of evidence for Dunning's thesis, all right? According to biographies that are a little bit court in their orientation of him, okay, that I've read lately, is they contend, almost like they do with Lincoln, that he kind of evolved for the better. He started off the war indifferent about Black Americans' plight and the issue of slavery. To him, and his primary source quotes at the beginning, it was all about loyalty versus treason and leaving the Union in the Civil War. When he began to receive, quote, contrabands, runaway African slaves that would see the Blue Coat Army and see that as their way of protection and freedom from the plantation, they would run to it. He showed evidence of being annoyed by it, slowed down by it, etc. But then slowly in time, he starts offering people, he starts asking for help to provide for them materially much better. He starts asking people to come and give them church services and give them some education. He asks for even teachers to come along. And he starts showing more of evidence of kind of a growing empathy. So I don't know how much it was for the humanitarian sake of protecting African Americans and how much it was about power and defiance of that power, right? Like, hey, we won the Civil War fair and square, South. And now you have these ex-Confederate cavalrymen wreaking havoc and not only attacking African Americans, but also Yankees, carpetbaggers, those in office, etc. All kinds of establishments. And so he gets Congress to give him a blank check in the Ku Klux Klan Acts, and he declares martial law against the KKK. And so at that point, they could come and shoot them on sight, and have outright open battles with them throughout the South. And so that helped, but it still did not keep the Ku Klux Klan from intimidating some African Americans away from participating any further in government. And so then you also have the waning interest from the North. Remember, 12 years is a long time. People's collective societal attention span is not that long. It looks like in hindsight. And you think of 9/11 or something like that, right? Like 12 years later. So at any rate, there was indignation in 1865 that the South needs to be put in its place. They need to develop a new South, was a generic term they used, and so forth. But now we're coming on, 10 years. And so now they're having in their newspapers, they're having all the new technology and marvels and the entire domination of industries by the robber barons, right? And the mechanization of production. They're having drama with the quote new immigrants beginning to surge in that are not WASP, okay? And then they also have the Indian Wars, as they were called, over the overland trails and the violations of the not really justifiable Fort Laramie and Medicine Lodge treaties, and fighting, Little Bighorn and all of that. So it gave them plenty of time to worry about and be concerned by other stuff. And so the North kind of just lost its ardor, its fire for it. And then in addition to that, you have the summation of it is the the presidential deal that was met. Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden had the highest number of electoral points, but neither had a majority, right? So the two go to the House of Reps, states the Constitution, where the House Reps decide between the two. Well, Rutherford B. Hayes made a promise, said, if you choose me, Southern House Reps, I promise to pull the Yankee troops out of the South and basically let the Southern states deal with their issues alone. And it evidently worked. They chose him. He evacuated the troops from the South, and it was seen by African Americans as the federal government's abandonment of the Black man and woman. And so it didn't take long after that for coercion, intimidation to come into effect, and have the Southern states one by one create the Jim Crow laws, which is going to make, the 14th and 15th Amendments. It's going to circumvent them. It's going to go around them, right? So successfully that the civil rights movement of the 1960s had to virtually start anew in the South. All right, so any questions? All right, well, number two. Number one is more factually rich than it is argumentative, and number two is more argumentative than it is factually rich. With number two, right, simple thesis is I'm contending you can't solve a cultural, a social problem with political solutions. That these laws were great. What was accomplished during the age of radical Reconstruction was wonderful, but it never could have been enough. Because remember, we steal from sociology that we look in history into at least three categories: political, economic, and social. So you could say what you want in allowing certain rights to African Americans to vote, to run for office, to purchase property, to be remunerated with a wage for their work, right? But to stop calling them the N-word, to stop despising them, to be open to your daughter marrying a Black man, that's just a whole other realm. That's just a whole other category. So I just contend very simply on number 2 that not enough was done in the social realm during Reconstruction. So I say, right, granted, it was good what the North did, but to make matters worse, right, is I cynically contend in number 2 that much that was done for African Americans was done with a wrong motive to begin with, as further evidence of the mountain that needed to be climbed in tackling the social phenomenon of racial prejudice, right? And hatred. So the federal government, there's evidence of the army coming in and freeing slaves and showing just disdain for them. The president, right? Andrew Johnson, oh my goodness. Frederick Douglass saw him and said he was no friend to my people. Supposedly he saw Frederick Douglass embracing Abraham Lincoln. And he said, Frederick Douglass contends that the future president, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, just looked with such anger and hatred. Like, how could his president hug a black man? So then you have what could have been done. All right. By the way, the argument for the test, okay, that that which was done for African Americans was done more in a desire to divide and conquer, cripple, punish the white South than it was out of altruism or humanitarianism toward the Black Americans. That is the thesis of William H. Dunning. So it's known as Dunning's thesis, that the Republicans of the North did what they did for African Americans primarily to punish the South, the white South, not out of being progressive and humanitarian. All right. So yes, you have the 13th through 15th Amendments. You have different civil rights acts that were passed by Congress, for sure. So notice here you had 600 state legislative positions went to African Americans. Thousands of local and state level offices. All right. And again, they established public schools, orphanages, prisons, workhouses, etc. So I'm trying to do the granted but approach, right? That granted, this was not all in vain. There were some steps made, but I'm simply saying it wasn't enough. It couldn't have been enough. So the first institution that I attack in the social realm that could have done more are the churches. You look at the Second Great Awakening, you look at the evangelical churches in the North prior to the Civil War, and many of them were embracing abolitionism. But not just abolitionism, but like the Transcendentalists, right? Conveying the fact that God plays no favorites, that a very egalitarian message, that we're all children of God and he plays no favorites. So places like Oberlin College, Finney, that's named after Charles Finney, Finneyite Oneida Institute. They accepted people of all gender, races, socioeconomic status, and that was unheard of. But notice they were in the North. And what did the South tend to do is they still would not address the major books of the Bible, the major parts of the Bible that could be used to advocate abolitionism and egalitarianism. They still segregated within the body of their church on Sundays. They did not tackle the sin of prejudice, and discrimination. So I'm contending the Southern churches really dropped the ball. They could have had a sociological, societal influence on that generation to let go of its hatred for African Americans and fear of them. In addition to that, the school system. I don't have an answer, but couldn't there have been a way they could have gotten around the failure of white parents to send their white kids to these public schools? Even if in the worst case scenario they had segregated schooling, what about the curriculum, etc.? But I'm pushing for something more optimistic than that, and that is integrated schooling, where not only through the curriculum they would learn egalitarian values and tolerance, but also through habituation, as Aristotle called it, right? Day by day, running and playing on the playground with a black kid, seeing how you both at different times skid your knee or elbow on the ground and you both bleed the same color blood. Seeing the Sambo image is not true of African Americans, and seeing the answers given by black students in class, et cetera, et cetera. So by curriculum, by pedagogy, right? Curriculum, that which is taught, pedagogy, how it's taught, and by habituation, black and white kids side by side in class and on the playground. That could have been, to me, that on number 2, that's a missed opportunity. That they could have tried to tackle these mountains in the social realm of discrimination and prejudice. The intelligentsia. Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Abraham Lincoln said, right, when he met her, so this is the little lady who made this big war. Such was the credit he gave to her sentimental novel and spreading, disseminating just compassion for the plight of the slaves. Why was nothing done, especially with the popularity of the sentimental novel alone? Why was nothing done by the Southern intelligentsia, the press, the writers, the teachers, the professors? Another institution I somewhat attack and say they dropped the ball. So you see here at the bottom, racism was never uprooted at its sources, as legislation, though it arguably constitutes a great start, has arguably never nor will ever suffice in eradicating it. Legal and institutional remedies will never suffice for a problem in the human head and heart. So you could see with the sad ending of Reconstruction, why some people call the civil rights movement of the 1960s the South's second Reconstruction. They're going to have to start all again. Any questions at all? I love this topic. All right. All right, you guys, that's it. If there are any questions, whatever, like I said, you guys are a very smart class. You guys seem to get my theses very well, very easily. But I like sharing it anyway. This stuff is fun, interesting. All right, so you guys have a good day, okay? I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. All right, so take care. Thank you for attending. You'll get your points on the reconstruction assignment. And that's it, okay? All right, thank you.